The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ranch as Eleanor wiped the sweat from her forehead. It was barely 8 o'clock, but the heat was already becoming unbearable. She stood on the wooden porch of her small ranch house, looking out at the mess that had become her life. 3 months ago, everything had been different. 3 months ago, her husband Robert was still alive, and this place actually felt like home now. As she stared at the gaping hole in her barn roof, Eleanor felt the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. The tornado that had ripped through their valley 2 weeks ago had taken more than just some wooden boards and shingles. It had taken away her last bit of hope. The barn had been Robert's pride and joy. He had built it himself when they first moved to this piece of land in New Mexico territory back in 1885. Every board had been carefully selected, every nail hammered with love and determination. Now half the roof was scattered across the prairie, and the remaining structure looked like a skeleton against the morning sky. Eleanor walked down the porch steps, her worn boots crunching on the dry earth. The chickens scattered as she approached, clucking their complaints about the disruption to their morning routine. She needed to fix that roof before the next storm hit. But she had no idea how she was going to manage it. Money was tighter than bark on a tree. The funeral had cost more than she had expected, and the medical bills from Robert's long illness had already drained most of their savings. She had exactly $12.37 to her name, and winter was coming fast. A proper barn. She would lose what little livestock she had left. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up from her worried thoughts. A lone rider was making his way slowly down the dirt road that led to her ranch. As he got closer, Eleanor could see that both the man and his horse looked like they had seen better days. Much better days. The horse was so thin that its ribs showed through its dull coat, and it walked with the careful steps of an animal that was running on nothing but determination. The rider wasn't in much better shape. His clothes were faded and patched in several places, and his hat had seen so much sun and rain that it was impossible to tell what color it had originally been. When the man reached her gate, he stopped and touched the brim of his hat in a polite greeting. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice rough from thirst and travel. "Name's Tom. I was wondering if you might have any work that needs doing around here." Eleanor studied him carefully. He was probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that was more necessity than fashion. His eyes were a deep brown, and despite his obvious hardship, they held a kindness that surprised her. Most drifters who came through these parts had a harder edge to them. "What kind of work can you do?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. She had learned to be careful about strangers, especially since Robert had passed. Tom glanced around the property, taking in the damaged barn, the sagging fence posts, and the general state of disrepair. "I can fix most anything that needs fixing," he said simply. "Carpentry, fence mending, roof work. I'm not asking for much, just a meal and maybe a place to rest my horse for the night." Eleanor felt a flutter of hope in her chest, but she tried not to show it. "That barn roof there," she said, pointing to the damaged structure. "You think you could handle something like that?" Tom turned to look at the barn, and Eleanor watched his face carefully. She had already had 2 other men look at the job, and both had shaken their heads and ridden away. The damage was extensive, and it would take skill and patience to fix it properly. But Tom didn't shake his head. Instead, he studied the barn for a long moment, his eyes moving from the damaged area to the intact portions, as if he was already planning the repair in his mind. "Yes, ma'am, I believe I could handle that," he said finally. "It's going to take some time, and I'll need materials, but the structure underneath looks solid enough. Your husband built this well." The mention of Robert brought a tightness to Eleanor's throat, but she pushed the emotion aside. "How much time are we talking about?" "Maybe a week, week and a half, if the weather holds," Tom replied. "I'd need to rebuild about 1/3 of the framework and replace all the damaged boards and shingles." Eleanor did some quick mental math. A week and a half of meals for one man, plus materials. She could probably manage the food, but the lumber and nails would cost money she didn't have. "I'll be honest with you," she said, surprising herself. With her openness, "I can't pay much. My husband passed recently and things are tight. I could manage 3 meals a day and a place to sleep, plus maybe $2 when the job's done." expected him to decline and ride away like the others had. $2 was hardly enough to make the work worthwhile, and most men would have laughed at such a small amount. But Tom just nodded slowly. "That sounds fair to me, ma'am. When would you like me to start?" Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. "You mean you'll actually do it? For just room and board and $2? "Yes, ma'am. My horse and I were both pretty hungry in winters. Coming on fast. Steady work and regular meals sound like a blessing right about now." For the first time in weeks, Eleanor felt something like relief wash over her. "Well then, I suppose you can put your horse in what's left of the barn. There's still some hay in the loft, and the water trough is still working." Tom dismounted. Slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. Up close, Eleanor could see that he was even thinner than she had first thought. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights and too few meals. "I appreciate this opportunity, ma'am," he said, as he led his horse toward the barn. "I promise you won't regret it." Eleanor watched him go, noting the way he moved with quiet confidence, despite his obvious exhaustion. There was something about him that didn't quite fit with the typical drifter image. His speech was educated, his manners were better than most, and there was a dignity to him that seemed at odds with his current circumstances. As she walked back toward the house to start preparing breakfast, Eleanor found herself wondering about Tom's story. How did a man who spoke like he had education and carried himself like he had been raised properly end up wandering the territory with nothing but the clothes on his back and a half-starved horse? But those were questions for another time. Right now, she had a barn roof that needed fixing, and for the first time since the tornado, she had someone willing to fix it for a price she could actually afford. She paused at her kitchen window and looked out at the barn, where Tom was already examining the damage more closely. Maybe, just maybe, her luck was finally starting to change. The rooster crowed just before dawn, but Tom was already awake. Eleanor watched from her kitchen window as he emerged from the barn, stretching his back and looking up at the sky. She had given him some old blankets and told him he could sleep in the barn's undamaged section, but she hadn't expected him to be up so early. She quickly put the coffee pot on the stove, started mixing batter for pancakes. When she stepped outside to call him for breakfast, she found him examining the barn roof with an intensity that surprised her. He wasn't just looking at the damage like the other men had done. He was studying every beam, every joint, running his hands along the wood and testing its strength. "Morning," she called out. "Breakfast is ready." Tom looked up, and for a moment Eleanor saw something in his eyes that made her pause. It wasn't the casual interest of a hired hand looking at a simple job. It was the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll be right there," he said, but he didn't move immediately. Instead, he continued examining the structure for another minute before finally walking toward the house at the breakfast table. Eleanor poured him coffee and watched as he ate. She had made extra pancakes, figuring a man his size who had been traveling would be hungry, but she was surprised by his table manners. He ate with quiet efficiency, thanking her for each serving, and actually used his napkin properly. Most of the ranch hands she had known ate like they were in a hurry too. "Get somewhere else." "You've done this kind of work before," she said. Wasn't really a question. Tom nodded, finishing his bite before answering. "Yes, ma'am. My father taught me carpentry when I was young. Said a man should know how to build things with his own hands." "Your father was a carpenter?" Tom's expression grew distant for a moment. "Among other things," he said quietly, then changed the subject. "I'll need to ride into town today to get materials. Do you have a wagon I could borrow?" Eleanor felt her heart sink. She had been hoping he might have his own supplies, though she knew that was unrealistic. "I have a wagon, but Tom, I need to be honest with you. I don't have much money for materials right now." Tom set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly. "How much can you manage? Maybe $15? $20 if I stretch it?" She felt embarrassed admitting how little she had. There was no point in lying. To her surprise, Tom nodded as if this was perfectly reasonable. "That should be enough for what we need. I know how to make materials stretch, and I've got some ideas for using what's already here." After breakfast, Tom hitched Eleanor's old mare to the wagon and prepared to head into town. Eleanor watched him work with the harness, noting again how his hands moved with practiced skill. Everything he did seemed deliberate and efficient, like he had been doing these tasks his whole life. "I should be back by afternoon," he said, climbing onto the wagon seat. "I'll get the best prices I can." Eleanor nodded, but as the wagon disappeared down the road, she found herself wondering again about this mysterious man. There was something about the way he carried himself that didn't quite fit with his story of being a simple drifter. When Tom returned that evening, the wagon was loaded with lumber, nails, and tar paper. Eleanor was amazed at how much he had managed to get for the money she had given him. "How did you manage all this?" she asked, looking at the supplies. Tom began unloading the materials with careful precision. "I know the lumber yard owner. Convinced him to give me a fair price in exchange for some work I did for him a few years back." "I thought you said you were just passing through the territory." Tom paused in his unloading, and Eleanor caught a flicker of something in his expression. "I've been through these parts before," he said simply, then continued working. The next morning, Tom began the actual repair work, and Eleanor's suspicions about his abilities were confirmed immediately. This wasn't the rough makeshift work she had expected from a traveling cowboy. Tom worked with the precision of a master craftsman. She watched from the house as he carefully removed the damaged sections of roof, saving every piece of usable wood. He didn't just tear things apart like most men would have done. Instead, he took the time to preserve anything that could be salvaged, organizing the materials in neat piles. When he began rebuilding the framework, Eleanor was amazed by his technique. Each cut was measured twice. Each joint was perfectly fitted. He reinforced areas that hadn't even been damaged, strengthening the entire structure beyond what it had been originally. "You're making it stronger than before," she commented, when she brought him water at midday. Tom wiped the sweat from his forehead and nodded. "No point in doing a job if you're not going to do it right. This roof should last you 20 years now, maybe 30 if you keep the gutters clean." Eleanor studied his work more closely. The joints were so precise, they looked like the work of a furniture maker, not a roof repair. "Where did you learn to work with like this?" Again, that distant look crossed Tom's face. "My father was very particular about craftsmanship. He used to say that how a man builds something shows who he really is inside." As the days passed, Eleanor found herself looking forward to their conversations during meals. Tom was well-spoken and clearly educated, though he was careful not to reveal too much about his past. He asked thoughtful questions about the ranch and seemed genuinely interested in her plans for the future. One evening, she noticed him reading one of Robert's books by candlelight in the barn. She had given him the candle so he could see to tend his horse, but seeing him read surprised her. Most of the ranch hands she had known couldn't read at all, let alone choose to spend their free time with books. The book he was reading was one of Robert's favorites, a collection of essays about agriculture and land management. Not exactly light reading for a tired cowboy at the end of a long day. "I hope you don't mind," Tom said, when he noticed her watching. "I saw the books on the shelf in the house and wondered if I could borrow one." "Of course not. Robert would have been happy to know someone was reading them." She paused, curiosity getting the better of her. "That's not the easiest book to get through." Tom smiled slightly. "I've always been interested in how things work. Farming, building, managing land. It's all connected, you know." Eleanor did know, but she was surprised that a drifting cowboy would understand such concepts. The more time she spent around Tom, the more questions she had about who he really was and what had brought him to her door. By the end of the week, the barn roof was nearly complete, and it was clearly the work of an expert. Tom had not only repaired the damage, but had improved the entire structure. The roof was stronger, better sealed, and more carefully constructed than it had ever been. As Eleanor looked at the beautiful craftsmanship, she realized that she had stumbled onto something extraordinary. This wasn't just any hungry cowboy looking for work. This was a man with skills, education, refinement that suggested a very different background than the one he had shared with her. The question was, what was a man like this doing, wandering the territory with nothing but the clothes on his back? The barn roof was finished, and it was beautiful. Eleanor stood in her yard, looking up at Tom's handiwork with a mixture of pride and sadness. Pride because her barn now looked better than it ever had, and sadness because she knew Tom would be moving on soon. In just over a week, he had become part of the daily rhythm of the ranch, and she was going to miss having him around. That evening, after Tom had gone to sleep in the barn, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and tried to face the pile of papers she had been avoiding. Robert's desk was still full of documents she needed to sort through: bills, land papers, business correspondence. She had been putting it off because going through his things made her feel like she was saying goodbye to him all over again. But winter was coming, and she needed to understand exactly where she stood financially. She pulled the lamp closer and began working through the stack of papers, sorting them into piles. Bills in one stack, important documents in another, personal letters in a third. About halfway through the pile, she found something that made her stop. It was a folded newspaper, yellowed with age, and tucked between some old receipts. The paper was from Denver, dated almost 2 years ago. Robert must have saved it for some reason, though Eleanor couldn't imagine why he would have kept an old newspaper. She unfolded it carefully. Her eyes were immediately drawn to a large headline on the front page: Railroad Empire Heir Disappears After Massive Theft Scandal. Below the headline was a detailed story about a young man named Thomas Rothschild, who had vanished after being accused of stealing $50,000 from his family's railroad company. Eleanor's hands began to shake as she read the article. The missing man was described as the son of railroad baron Jonathan Rothschild, one of the wealthiest men in the West. According to the story, Thomas had been caught embezzling money from the company payroll and had disappeared the night before. He was supposed to appear in court, but it was the photograph that made Eleanor's blood turn cold. Despite the formal clothes and clean-shaven face in the picture, she recognized those dark brown eyes immediately. The man in the photograph was Tom the same. Tom, who was sleeping in her barn right now. Eleanor stared at the picture for a long time, her mind racing. The man she had hired to fix her roof, the man she had been sharing meals with for over a week, was wanted for stealing more money than she would see in 10 lifetimes. He was also the heir to one of the biggest railroad fortunes in the country. She read the article again, more carefully this time. The theft had happened in Colorado at the main office of Rothschild Railroad. Thomas had been the company's payroll manager, and the money had disappeared from the employee payment fund. Dozens of railroad workers had gone without pay because of the theft. The article mentioned that there was a $5,000 reward for information, leading to Thomas Rothschild's capture. $5,000. Eleanor thought about that number. It was more money than she had ever seen at one time. It was enough to save her ranch, pay off all her debts, and live comfortably for years. She set the newspaper down and walked to the window. Looking out at the barn where Tom was sleeping, her mind was spinning with questions. If Tom really was Thomas Rothschild, why was he wandering around the territory as a poor cowboy? Why would the heir to a railroad fortune be sleeping in barns and working for $2? Maybe he was innocent. Maybe there was more to the story than the newspaper told. But then again, maybe he really was a thief who had stolen money from working people and was now hiding out in the countryside. Eleanor spent most of the night awake, staring at the ceiling, and trying to decide what to do. Part of her wanted to saddle her horse and ride to town to tell the sheriff what she had discovered. The reward money would solve all her problems, and if Tom really had stolen from railroad workers, he deserved to face justice. But another part of her remembered the man who had spent the last week working on her roof. Tom had been kind, respectful, and had done beautiful work for almost no pay. He had asked for nothing more than food and shelter, and he had treated her with more courtesy than most men showed to widows. Could a person like that really be a criminal? The next morning, Eleanor made breakfast as usual, but her hands were shaking as she cooked. When Tom came in from the barn, she could barely look at him. She kept glancing at his face, comparing it to the photograph in the newspaper, which she had hidden in her apron pocket. "Morning, Eleanor," Tom said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Roof's all finished. Just need to clean up the work area, and I'll be ready to move on." Eleanor's heart jumped at the word move on. If she was going to confront him about the newspaper, it had to be now. "Tom," she said, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." Tom sat down at the table and looked at her with those same kind eyes. She had grown accustomed to seeing Eleanor pulled the newspaper from her pocket and set it on the table between them. Tom's face changed immediately when he saw it. The color drained from his cheeks, and his shoulders sagged like a man who had been carrying a heavy load for too long.
"So you know,"
he said quietly, not bothering to deny what she had discovered. "Know what this newspaper says?" Eleanor replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "But I don't know what really happened." Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the newspaper. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a sadness that made Eleanor's chest tight. "I didn't steal that money," he said simply. "But I can't prove it. I can't go back to face the charges because I don't think I'd live long enough to see a trial." "What do you mean?" Tom rubbed his face with both hands, looking suddenly much older than his 30-something years. "The man who really stole the money is my father's business partner, Vincent Hartwell. He's been skimming from the company for years, but he's smart about it. When the big theft was discovered, he made sure all the evidence pointed to me." Leonard felt her heart racing. Why would he do that? "Because I found out what he was doing. I discovered his scheme and confronted him about it. I told him I was going to tell my father everything." Tom's voice was bitter. 2 days later, $50,000 went missing. Somehow all the paperwork showed that I was the one who took it. "But surely your father would believe you over a business partner." Tom's laugh was harsh and empty. "My father and Vincent have been friends for 20 years. Vincent has been like a second father to me since I was a boy. When the evidence came out, even my own father believed I was guilty." Eleanor studied Tom's face as he spoke. She had become good at reading people. During her years as a ranch wife, and everything about his expression and tone told her he was telling the truth. "So you ran," she said. "I ran, like a coward. I should have stayed and fought the charges, but I was scared. Vincent has connections everywhere. He could have had me killed in jail and made it look like an accident." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. She was harboring a fugitive, but if Tom was telling the truth, he was an innocent man who had been framed by someone much more powerful than him. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Eleanor stared at Tom across the kitchen table, her mind racing with possibilities. The reward money could save her ranch, but something about his story felt true. She had spent enough years reading people to know when someone was lying, and Tom's pain seemed genuine. "Show me," she said finally. Tom looked confused. "Show you what?" "Show me proof? If Vincent really framed you, there has to be evidence somewhere. You said you discovered his scheme. What kind of evidence did you find?" Eyes widened slightly, as if this was the first time anyone had asked him to prove his innocence, instead of just running away. I had documents, ledger pages, receipts, bank records, but I left everything behind when I ran." Eleanor leaned forward. "What kind of documents?" Vincent was clever about it. "He would create fake employee names on the payroll, then pocket their wages. He also inflated the costs of supplies and kept the difference. I found discrepancies going back almost 3 years." Tom's voice grew stronger as he talked about the details. The fake employees all had addresses that didn't exist. The supply invoices were from companies that Vincent owned under different names, and you just left all of this evidence behind. Tom looked ashamed. "I was scared. When I confronted Vincent, he laughed and told me no one would believe me, said he had been preparing for this moment for months. The next day, the money was missing, and all the evidence pointed to me. I panicked and ran." Eleanor stood up and began pacing around the small kitchen. Her husband Robert had always said she was too stubborn for her own good, but right now she was grateful for that stubbornness. An idea was forming in her mind, and the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. "Tom, what if we could prove Vincent was the real thief? How would we do that? I told you I left all the evidence behind." Eleanor stopped pacing and looked at him directly. "But Vincent doesn't know you left it behind. And he doesn't know that. You know about his other schemes? What if we could trick him into revealing himself?" Tom shook his head. "Eleanor, you don't understand how dangerous this man is. His money, power, and connections. If he even suspected you were involved in trying to expose him, he would destroy you without thinking twice. Maybe, but I'm already being destroyed. Eleanor sat back down and spread her hands on the table. Tom, I have $12 to my name. The bank is going to foreclose on this ranch in 2 months. I'm going to lose everything Robert and I built. Together. So tell me, what exactly do I have to lose by taking a risk? Tom studied her face for a long moment. You have your life to lose. Vincent has had people killed for less than what we're talking about. Then we better be smarter than him. Over the next hour, Eleanor and Tom worked out the basics of a plan. Tom would write a letter to Vincent claiming he was tired of running and ready to make a deal. He would offer to disappear permanently in exchange for a share of the money Vincent had stolen over the years. The letter would hint that Tom had hidden evidence that could expose Vincent's crimes. Vincent's greed will get the better of him, Tom explained. He'll want to know what evidence I have and where I hid it, but he'll also be suspicious of a trap, so we make it believable, Eleanor said. You write the letter from here, using my address. Tell him you're working on a ranch in New Mexico and that you're desperate enough to make a deal. And then what? Eleanor smiled grimly. Then we wait for him to come to us. Tom looked horrified. Eleanor, you can't be serious. Vincent comes. Here, he'll kill both of us. Not if we're prepared for him. Not if we have help. Eleanor explained the rest of her idea. While Tom wrote the letter, she would ride into town and have a conversation with Sheriff Anderson. She wouldn't tell him about Tom's true identity, but she would mention that she had heard rumors about railroad corruption and ask what a person should do if they had evidence of crimes. Sheriff Anderson is an honest man, Eleanor said. He's also smart enough to read between the lines. If I can get him interested in the idea of railroad corruption, he might be willing to help when the time comes. Tom was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the barn he had just finished repairing. This is crazy, he said finally. We're talking about going up against one of the most powerful men in the railroad business. Yes, we are. But Tom, think about it this way. What's the worst that can happen? Hey, we fail and Vincent has us killed. Well, I'm probably going to die anyway when winter comes and I don't have money for food or fuel. At least this way, we go down fighting. Something in Eleanor's voice must have convinced him because Tom nodded slowly. All right, but we do this. Carefully, one mistake, and we're both dead. They spent the rest of the day working out the details of their plan. Tom would write the letter in a way that would make Vincent curious but not suspicious. He would mention specific details about the fake employees and inflated invoices. It's just enough to prove he knew about Vincent's schemes, but not enough to seem like a threat. Eleanor would ride into town the next day and have her conversation with the sheriff. She would also send Tom's letter through the postal service, making sure it was postmarked from the local post office. How long do you think it will take Vincent to respond? Eleanor asked as they worked. If he takes the bait, probably 2 weeks, maybe 3. He'll want to investigate first. Make sure this isn't some kind of trap set up by the law. That evening, Eleanor found herself looking at Tom differently. The scared, desperate man who had knocked on her door asking for work was still there. But now she could see glimpses of the educated, wealthy young man he had once been. When he talked about business and corruption, his voice carried the authority of someone who understood how these things worked. Tom, can I ask you something? Personal? Of course. What was your life like before all this happened? I mean, you were rich. You had a future. What was that like? Tom was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire Eleanor had built in the fireplace. Lonely, he said finally. I had money, fine clothes, a big house, but I didn't have many real friends. Most people wanted to be around me because of my father's money, not because they actually liked me. Is that why you've been so kind to me? Because I didn't know who you were? Tom looked at her with surprise. Eleanor, you've been kind to me because that's who you are? You took in a stranger, fed him, gave him work when you could barely afford? That's not something you do because of money or social position. That's something you do because you have a good heart. Eleanor felt her cheeks grow warm. I had practical reasons too. I needed that roof fixed. Maybe, but you trusted me. Enough to let me sleep in your barn and eat at your table. Most people wouldn't have done that for a drifter. As Eleanor prepared for bed that night, she realized that somewhere in the past week and a half, Tom had stopped being just a hired hand and had become something like a friend. Maybe even more than a friend, though she wasn't ready to examine. those feelings too closely. Tomorrow, they would put their dangerous plan into motion. Either they would succeed in exposing Vincent and clearing Tom's name, or they would both end up dead. But for tonight, Eleanor felt more hopeful than she had. Since Robert died, she had a purpose again, and she had someone fighting beside her. 3 weeks had passed since Tom sent the letter, and Eleanor was beginning to think their plan had failed. Maybe Vincent had seen through their trap, or maybe he simply didn't care enough about Tom's threats to respond. Either way, the waiting was driving her crazy. Then, on a cold Tuesday morning, a stranger rode up to her ranch. Eleanor was feeding the chickens when she heard the horse approaching. She looked up to see a well-dressed man on a beautiful black stallion, the kind of horse that cost more money than most people saw in a year. The rider was probably in his 50s, with silver hair and expensive clothes that looked out of place. "In the rough country of New Mexico Territory, Mrs. Martinez," the man called out as he dismounted. His voice was smooth and cultured, but something about it made Eleanor's skin crawl. "Yes, that's me," Eleanor replied, trying to keep her voice steady. She had a terrible feeling she knew exactly who this man was. "My name is Vincent Hartwell. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Eleanor's heart began racing, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hartwell, but I don't know what you're talking about." Vincent smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Oh, I think you do. See, I received a very interesting letter a few weeks ago. A letter that was postmarked from this town and signed by someone I've been looking for. I still don't understand. Where is Thomas Rothschild, Mrs. Martinez?" Eleanor tried to look confused. "I don't know anyone by that name." Vincent's smile grew wider and more dangerous. "Please don't insult my intelligence. The letter came from this address. Thomas is here, and I want to speak with him." Eleanor glanced toward the barn, hoping Tom was ready for this moment. According to their plan, he should be hidden in the loft with a clear view of the yard. She just had to keep Vincent talking until Sheriff Anderson arrived. "Even if I did know someone by that name," Eleanor said carefully, "why would that be any business of yours?" "Because Thomas stole $50,000 from my railroad company and disappeared. I'm here to collect both the money and the thief." $1,000? That's an awful lot of money. "Are you sure this Thomas person actually stole it?" Vincent's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" Eleanor took a deep breath. This was the dangerous part of their plan. "Well, I'm just a simple ranch woman. But it seems to me that if someone really wanted to steal that much money, they'd be smart enough to disappear somewhere far away. Why would they stick around close enough to send letters? Perhaps because they're not as smart as they think they are. Or perhaps," Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger, "because they didn't actually steal the money in the first place."
Oh.
Vincent's expression changed completely. The fake politeness disappeared, replaced by something cold and threatening. "You're walking on very dangerous ground, Mrs. Martinez. Am I? Or am I just asking reasonable questions?" Before Vincent could respond, Tom emerged from the barn. Eleanor felt her heart jump. This wasn't part of their plan. Tom was supposed to stay hidden until the sheriff arrived. "Hello, Vincent," Tom said quietly. "It's been a long time." Vincent spun around, his hand moving instinctively toward his coat. Eleanor noticed he was carrying a gun. "Thomas, you look terrible. I hardly recognized you. Running for your life tends to change a person," Tom replied. He walked slowly toward them, his hands visible and empty. "I got your message that you wanted to meet." "My message? I think you have that backwards. You wrote to me, remember? Something about making a deal?" Tom nodded. "That's right. I'm tired of running, Vincent. I want this to end." "Good, then you can return the money you stole and come back to face justice." "What money?" Tom asked. "Mean the money you stole and blamed on me?" Vincent laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Still telling that same lie, I see? Do you really think anyone will believe you?" "I think they might when they see the evidence." Vincent's hand moved closer to his gun. "What evidence?" "The records I kept of your fake employees, the receipts from your shell companies, the bank statement showing where the money really went. You're bluffing. You left everything behind when you ran." Tom smiled for the first time since Vincent had arrived. Are you sure about that?" Eleanor watched Vincent's face carefully. She could see him thinking, trying to figure out if Tom was telling the truth. The greed in his eyes was exactly what Tom had predicted. "Even if you had evidence," Vincent said slowly, "who would believe it? I'm a respected businessman. You're a wanted fugitive. Maybe, but I'm not the only one who knows the truth anymore." Vincent's eyes darted to Eleanor, then back to Tom. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," said a new voice, "that we've been listening to this entire conversation." Sheriff Anderson stepped out from behind the house, his gun drawn and pointed at Vincent. Behind him came two deputy sheriffs, also armed. Vincent's face went white. "This is a setup." "Yes, it is," Tom said calmly. "And you just confessed to everything." Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her. Their plan had worked perfectly. The sheriff had arrived at exactly the right time and had heard Vincent's own words condemning him. "Can't prove anything," Vincent said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Sheriff," Anderson smiled grimly, "actually we can. You see, Mrs. Martinez came to me 3 weeks ago with some very interesting information about railroad corruption. She suggested that if someone had evidence of such crimes, the law might be interested in hearing about it." And then Tom added, "When I wrote that letter to you, I also wrote one to my father's lawyers. I told them everything about your schemes, about how you framed me, about where to find the evidence I had hidden before I ran." Vincent's shoulders sagged as he realized he had been completely outmaneuvered. "The evidence was destroyed years ago." "No, it wasn't. I hid copies in a safe deposit box in Denver before I confronted you. I was young, but I wasn't stupid." Sheriff Anderson moved closer to Vincent. "Vincent Hartwell, you're under arrest for theft, fraud, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." As the sheriff handcuffed Vincent, the man who had seemed so powerful and dangerous just minutes before looked like nothing more than a tired, defeated criminal. "This isn't over," Vincent said as the deputies led him away. "I have friends, connections. I'll be out of jail before the week is over." "Maybe," Tom said, "but by then the newspapers will have the whole story. Your friends won't want to be connected to you anymore." After Vincent was taken away, Eleanor and Tom stood alone in the yard, hardly able to believe what had just happened. "We did it," Eleanor said softly. "We actually did it." Tom nodded, but he looked almost sad. "Yes, we did. In a few weeks, I'll be cleared of all charges. I can go back to my old life, reclaim my inheritance, return to the railroad business." Eleanor felt her heart sink. Of course, Tom would want to return to his previous life. Why would he want to stay on a small ranch in New Mexico when he could have wealth and power? "That's wonderful," she said, trying to sound happy for him. "You'll have everything back that you lost?" Tom looked at her for a long moment. "Eleanor, what if I don't want everything back?" "What do you mean? What if I've learned that the most important things in life aren't money and power? What if I've discovered that a simple life with the right person is worth more than all the railroad empires in the world?" Elena's heart began beating faster. "Tom, what are you saying?" Tom took her hands in his. "I'm saying that the best thing that ever happened to me was knocking on your door asking for work. I'm saying that I want to stay here, help you build this ranch into something special. I'm saying that I've fallen in love with you, Eleanor Martinez, and I'm hoping you might feel the same way about me." Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw her future there, a future filled with love, partnership, and hope. "Yes," she said simply. "I do feel the same way." The starving cowboy who had come to fix her barn roof had given her something much more valuable than good carpentry. He had given her back her dreams,